The boy from Umvezo became a lawyer. The lawyer became an activist. The activist became an underground revolutionary. The revolutionary became a prisoner. The prisoner became a negotiator. The negotiator became a president. And the president became a symbol. But perhaps the most important transformation was quieter. A man who had every reason to hate decided that a nation could not be built on revenge alone. Nelson Rockefeller Mandela once walked out of prison with the world watching, but his longest walk had begun decades earlier in the hills of the Eastern Cape with a boy named Rockefeller, a boy whose father had taught him pride, whose people had taught him history, whose country taught him injustice, whose prison taught him patience, and whose freedom taught the world that sometimes the most powerful act of defiance is to survive long enough to imagine something better. In 1941, Nelson Mandela fled towards Johannesburg. Historical timelines record that he and Justice resisted the planned marriages and left for the city, a decision that opened the next decisive chapter of Mandela's life. He could not have known it then, but the young man running from marriage was running directly toward history. Johannesburg was another world, a city of gold, industry, wealth, migration, and racial hierarchy. Mandela arrived young, ambitious, and inexperienced. He found work. He encountered poverty. He saw more directly than ever before the machinery of white supremacy. South Africa's racial oppression did not begin with apartheid in 1948. Dispossession and segregation had deep roots. But when the National Party came to power in 1948, apartheid transformed racial domination into an increasingly systematic architecture of law, where people could live, where people could work, whom they could marry, what schools they could attend, which entrances they could use, whether they could vote. The color of a person's skin could determine the geography of an entire life. In Johannesburg, Mandela met people who changed him. Among the most important was Walter Sisulu. Through networks of activists and intellectuals, Mandela entered a political world far broader than the traditional society of his youth. He studied law. He became involved with the African National Congress, the ANC. In 1944, Mandela helped sustain the ANC Youth League alongside figures including Anton Lembede, Oliver Tambo, and Walter Sisulu. The younger activists were impatient. They wanted mass action, boycotts, strikes, civil disobedience, a more assertive African nationalism. That same year, Mandela married Evelyn Ntoko Massey. She was a nurse. The marriage produced children. For a time, Mandela attempted to inherit two worlds: family man, political activist, husband, father, organizer. But politics was consuming him, and the cost would increasingly be paid at home. Mandela rose within the ANC. In 1952, the Defiance Campaign mobilized resistance against unjust apartheid laws. That year, Mandela and Oliver Tambo established a law practice in Johannesburg, Mandela and Tambo. It became one of South Africa's best known black legal partnerships. For black South Africans navigating a racist legal system, the office represented something extraordinary. Here were black lawyers defending black clients inside a system designed to subordinate them. Mandela saw humiliation every single day. Passed laws, forced removals, police power, families separated by bureaucracy. The law was not abstract. It entered people's homes. It controlled movement. It criminalized existence. The government responded to resistance with bans, restrictions, and prosecutions. In 1956, Mandela was among more than 150 activists arrested and charged with treason. The treason trial would drag on for years. Eventually, the defendants were acquitted. But by then, South Africa had changed. And so had Mandela. Because on the 21st of March 1960, in the township of Sharpeville, police opened fire on protesters. 69 people lost their lives. The massacre shocked the world. The government declared a state of emergency. The ANC was banned. The political landscape narrowed, and Mandela confronted a terrible question. What happens when peaceful protest is answered with bullets? By the late 1950s, Mandela's private life had already been transformed. His marriage to Evelyn had collapsed. The reasons were deeply personal and political. Mandela's activism demanded enormous absences. Evelyn's religious commitments and Mandela's political life moved them in different directions. They divorced in 1958. That same year, Mandela married Nomzamo Winifred Madikizela. The world would know her name as Winnie Mandela. She was young, charismatic, a social worker, strong-willed, and she was marrying a man whose life was already becoming inseparable from struggle. The marriage would become one of the most famous and painful political relationships of the 20th century. Mandela went underground. He moved secretly, changed appearances, avoided police. The press called him the Black Pimpernel. But the struggle was entering a new phase. After Sharpeville and the banning of liberation organizations, Mandela concluded that nonviolent methods alone were no longer sufficient. In 1961, he became a leading figure in the creation of Mkhonto Wesizwe, the spur of the nation, commonly known as MK. Its initial campaign focused on sabotage against infrastructure and symbols of the state with an intention to avoid loss of life where possible. This is a crucial part of Mandela's story. The elderly statesman, remembered for reconciliation, had once helped establish an armed organization, not because he had suddenly stopped valuing life, but because he believed the state had closed peaceful avenues of resistance. Whether one agrees with that decision or not, it must be understood. Mandela was not born a symbol of forgiveness. He became one through history. In 1962, Mandela secretly left South Africa. He traveled across Africa. He sought political support. He received military training. He encountered independent African states at a moment when colonial empires were retreating across the continent. Imagine what that must have meant. A black South African living under apartheid, seeing African countries governed by Africans. The psychological impact was profound. But when he returned, the state was waiting. On the 5th of August 1962, Mandela was arrested near Howick. He was later convicted of leaving the country without a passport and inciting workers to strike. He received a 5-year sentence, but that was only the beginning. Because in 1963, police raided Lil's Leaf Farm in Rivonia. Documents were discovered, leaders were arrested, and Mandela, already imprisoned, was brought into what became the most famous trial of his life. The Foundation's archival biography traces his 1962 arrest, imprisonment, the Lil's Leaf raid, and the subsequent Rivonia proceedings. The charge was sabotage. The possible punishment was death. The Rivonia trial was not merely a legal proceeding. It was theater, politics, history. The apartheid state wanted to destroy the leadership of the resistance. The defendants understood that the courtroom might become their final platform. On April 20th, 1964, Nelson Mandela stood in the dock. He did not beg. He did not apologize. He explained the struggle. He spoke of white domination. He spoke of black domination. And he declared his commitment to a democratic and free society in which all people could live together with equal opportunities. Then came the words that would echo across decades. It was, he said, an ideal he hopes to live for and achieve, but if necessary, an ideal for which he was prepared to die. There are moments when a human being speaks without knowing whether the words will become an epitaph. This was one of them. Mandela and his co-accused waited. Would they hang? On June 12, 1964, the sentence came. Not death, life imprisonment. Mandela was 45 years old. He had children, a wife, a mother, a political movement, a life outside. Then the prison doors closed, and for the next 27 years, Nelson Mandela would not be free. Robben Island sits in the cold waters off Cape Town. For centuries, it had been used as a place of isolation. Now it became the prison most closely associated with apartheid. Mandela arrived as a political prisoner. His world shrank. A cell, a mat, a bucket, routine, surveillance, hard labor. Prisoners worked in the lime quarry. The glare damaged Mandela's eyes. The dust entered his lungs. Letters were restricted. Visits were rare. Contact with children became fragments of life. The Nelson Mandela Foundation's prison chronology records more than 27 years of incarceration. 18 of those years were spent on Robben Island before later transfers to Portsmouth and Victor Verster. Mandela also fought prison battles for trousers instead of shorts, for better food, for study rights, for dignity. Small victories mattered because apartheid attempted to make inequality appear natural. Even inside prison, resistance continued. But the greatest pain was personal. In 1968, Mandela's mother sadly died. He was not allowed to attend her funeral. Then, in 1969, his eldest son, Thembekile, died in a car accident. Again, Mandela was denied permission to attend the funeral. Consider that. The world would later celebrate Mandela's sacrifice, but sacrifice is an easy word when spoken by people who did not pay its price. A father lost his son and could not bury him. A son lost his mother and could not stand at her grave. His children grew older without him. His marriage existed through prison glass, letters, memory, and political mythology. Outside prison, Winnie Mandela faced persecution of her own, banning orders, harassment, detention, separation. She became an increasingly powerful and controversial figure. The marriage changed under pressure, almost impossible to imagine. Mandela was becoming a global symbol. Winnie was surviving the brutal reality outside. They were husband and wife, but history was pulling them into different worlds. Years passed, one decade, then another. Mandela entered prison in the 1960s. By the 1980s, the world outside had transformed. Children who had not been born when he was sentenced were now demanding his freedom. Music carried his name. Posters carried his face. Campaigners demanded sanctions. Governments came under immense pressure. The phrase spread across continents. Free Nelson Mandela. In 1985, South African President P.W. Botha offered Mandela conditional release if he renounced violence. Mandela refused the terms. His answer, communicated through his daughter, Zinzi, carried a fundamental question: what freedom was being offered when the organization of the people remained banned, when Black South Africans remained unfree? But behind the scenes, something else was beginning. Talk, tentative, secret, dangerous. Mandela began communicating with representatives of the apartheid state. Some comrades feared he was moving alone, but Mandela understood something. Wars end when enemies eventually speak. In 1982, he had been transferred from Robben Island to Portsmouth prison. Later, after tuberculosis and medical treatment, he was moved to Victor Verster prison. The cell had become a house. The conditions had changed. The negotiations deepened. Then, in 1989, F.W. de Klerk became South Africa's president. History accelerated. On the 2nd of February 1990, de Klerk announced the unbanning of the ANC and other organizations. 9 days later, the prison gate opened. On the 11th of February 1990, Nelson Mandela walked free. 27 years had passed. He entered prison at 44. He emerged at 71. The world saw triumph, but South Africa was not yet free. In fact, some of the most dangerous years still lay ahead. The country was violent. Political killings intensified. Communities burned. There were clashes involving rival political movements. Far-right white groups threatened resistance. The fear of civil war was real. Mandela now faced an almost impossible task: negotiate with the governments that had imprisoned him while maintaining the confidence of people who had suffered under that same government. His relationship with F.W. de Klerk was difficult. They could cooperate, they could clash, they could accuse one another, yet both men understood that South Africa stood at the edge of catastrophe. Negotiations advanced, stalled, resumed, then came moments that tested everything. In 1993, Chris Hani, a hugely popular anti-apartheid leader, was assassinated by a white extremist. South Africa trembled. Mandela addressed the nation, not yet president, but already behaving like one. His appeal for calm helped prevent the country from descending further into chaos. That same year, Mandela and de Klerk jointly received the Nobel Peace Prize. The symbolism was extraordinary. Prisoner and president, liberation leader and leader of the state, two men sharing a prize while still disagreeing profoundly. But freedom had a private cost. The marriage to Winnie had deteriorated. They separated in 1992. Their divorce was finalized in 1996. The love story that had once symbolized resistance could not survive what history had done to them. This is one of the harder truths in Mandela's life. He helped negotiate the future of a nation, but he could not rescue his own marriage. On April 27th, 1994, South Africans voted in a fully democratic national election. The images remain unforgettable. Long queues, men and women waiting for hours. Elderly black South Africans preparing to vote nationally for the very first time. People who had spent lifetimes treated as subjects now becoming citizens. The ANC won, and on the 10th of May 1994, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was inaugurated as President of South Africa.
This continent knows the true meaning of racism. Its peoples have both been perpetrators of racism against others and themselves the victims of an insane and murderous racist ideology.
The prisoner had entered the Union buildings as head of state. The official Mandela chronology and foundation timeline record the election and presidency that made him South Africa's first democratically elected president. The symbolism was immense, but Mandela understood symbolism as a political weapon. He reached toward former enemies. He included opponents in government. He supported national reconciliation. Perhaps no moment captured this more powerfully than the 1995 Rugby World Cup. Rugby had long been associated with white Afrikaner identity. Many black South Africans saw the Springbok emblem as a symbol of apartheid. Mandela saw an opportunity. He appeared wearing the Springbok jersey. When South Africa won the tournament, the image of Mandela presenting the trophy to Captain Francois Pena became one of the defining photographs of the new nation. It did not erase inequality. It did not repair centuries of injustice. But for a moment, it offered South Africans a picture of themselves they had rarely seen together. Mandela also supported the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Victims testified. Perpetrators could seek amnesty under defined conditions by making full disclosure of politically motivated crimes. The process was imperfect, painful, controversial. Some believed justice had been sacrificed. Others believed the country could not survive mass revenge. The deeper question was enormous. How does a nation remember evil without becoming imprisoned by it? Mandela's presidency should not be romanticized. South Africa remained profoundly unequal. Poverty was immense. The legacy of apartheid could not be undone in 5 years. Crime, unemployment, housing shortages, and economic disparities remained. And Mandela's government faced criticism, including over the emerging HIV/AIDS catastrophe and the limitations of transformation. Mandela was not a magician. No president could reverse centuries of dispossession with speeches. But his greatest presidential achievement may have been more fundamental. He helped establish the idea that political power could change hands without racial civil war. And then he did something many leaders find almost impossible. He left after just one term. In 1999, Nelson Mandela stepped down as president. A man who had waited decades for freedom did not cling indefinitely to office. That decision strengthened his legend. Mandela's later years brought another unexpected chapter: love. On his 80th birthday, 18th July 1998, Nelson Mandela married Graça Machel. She was a formidable figure in her own right, a humanitarian, former education minister of Mozambique, and the widow of Mozambique's first president, Samora Machel. Mandela had been married to Evelyn, then Winnie, now, late in life, Graça. The marriage revealed something often lost beneath the monument. Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was not merely a political symbol. He was a man who disliked loneliness, a man who needed companionship, a man whose public life had repeatedly damaged his private one. After leaving the presidency, Mandela remained active. He worked on peace initiatives, children's causes, education, and increasingly HIV/AIDS. This issue became painfully personal. In 2005, Mandela announced that his son, Makato, had died of an AIDS-related illness. At a time when stigma remained powerful, Mandela spoke openly. He urged people to treat AIDS as an ordinary disease, to speak its name, to remove shame. It was one of the most personal interventions of his later life. His global stature grew. Presidents sought him. Celebrities admired him. His birthday, 18 July, became associated internationally with service through Mandela Day. The United Nations General Assembly formally established Nelson Mandela International Day in 2009. Yet age was catching him. Public appearances became fewer. The man who had once crossed borders secretly, who had endured prison labor, who had danced at rallies, was becoming physically frail. But the symbol remained enormous. In his final years, Nelson Mandela increasingly withdrew from public life. His health declined. He suffered recurring respiratory problems linked in public memory to the years of imprisonment and the harsh conditions he had endured. Hospital admissions became major international news. The world watched. South Africa waited. Then, on the 5th of December 2013, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela died. He was 95 years old. President Jacob Zuma announced his death. Across South Africa, people gathered. Some cried, some sang, some danced. Flowers appeared, flags were lowered. World leaders prepared to travel. The foundation records Mandela's death on 5th December 2013, closing a life of 95 years that had stretched from colonial era rural Transkei to democratic South Africa. His memorial service drew leaders from across the globe. But perhaps the most powerful tributes were simpler, ordinary people, people who remembered where they were when he walked free, people who had voted for the first time in 1994, people who had once been told by law that they were less human than others. Mandela was eventually laid to rest in Kunu, the rural landscape of his childhood. After prison cells, courtrooms, presidential offices, state banquets, and global stages, the journey ended near the hills where a boy had once herded cattle. The circle had closed, but the argument over Nelson Mandela had not. So, who was Nelson Mandela? The easy answer is a hero, but easy answers rarely survive history. Mandela was a freedom fighter. He was also a man who embraced armed struggle when he believed peaceful avenues had been closed. He was a husband 3 times, a father whose political commitment repeatedly took him away from his children, a prisoner who lost 27 years, a negotiator who spoke to his enemies, a president who preached reconciliation, a global icon whose image sometimes became simpler than the man himself. There is a danger in turning Mandela into a saint. Saints can be admired and then ignored. A perfect Mandela asked nothing difficult of us, but the real Mandela does. The real Mandela forces us to ask, what would we sacrifice for justice? Can we negotiate without surrendering principle? Can we understand an enemy without becoming one? Can a person change? Can a nation? Can forgiveness exist without forgetting? And what happens when political freedom arrives, but economic inequality remains? South Africa, after Mandela, did not become a paradise. The country continued to struggle with inequality, poverty, unemployment, corruption, violence. The wounds of apartheid remained deep. That does not mean Mandela's dream was meaningless. It means liberation is not an event. It is a process. An election can change a government. It cannot instantly change the distribution of land, wealth, opportunity, memory, trauma. Perhaps Mandela's greatest achievement was not that he forgave. That word is too simple. Perhaps it was that after 27 years of imprisonment, he refused to allow his jailers to determine the kind of man he would become. They controlled his cell, his letters, his visits, his movements. For decades, they controlled almost every physical detail of his life. But in the end, they did not control his imagination of the future.
Sigelela
Nelson Rochelala Mandela, 1918 to 2013, prisoner, president, father, flawed man, global icon, and one of the most consequential Africans who ever lived. The long walk continues.